All right, we're live.
जिंदाबाद साथियों, मेरा नाम शिवा है और आप सभी का स्वागत है NAPM के युवा संवाद के आज के सत्र में। वेलकम, गुड इवनिंग टू एवरीवन टू NAPM's युवा संवाद today's session. To begin with, we take a lot of pride in the fact that we are a very young country. हम एक बहुत ही युवा देश हैं, मगर भारत के युवाओं की क्या समस्याएं हैं, क्या मुद्दे हैं, क्या ड्रीम्स एंड एस्पिरेशंस हैं, इसको लेकर क्या निष्ठा है, क्या काम हो रहा है इसके पीछे, इसको लेके एक मंशा की स्थिति रहती है। और इस कोई शक नहीं है इसमें कि इसको लेकर एक डाउट हम लोग के मन में है कि हमारा क्या विजन है इसको लेके, डिस्पाइट टेकिंग अ लॉट ऑफ प्राइड इन इट। इसी बात के मद्देनजर NAPM युवा संवाद नामक ये सीरीज करता है और पिछले एक महीने से इन द मंथ ऑफ जनवरी वी हैव बीन होल्डिंग द युवा संवाद सीरीज स्पेसिफिकली ऑन द एरिया ऑफ एजुकेशन एंड जिसमें हमने एजुकेशन से रिलेटेड अलग अलग मुद्दों पे बात की। युवा साथियों, अलग अलग युवा प्रदेशों के युवा साथी हमारे साथ जुड़े और अलग अलग मुद्दों पे हमने बात की। पहले सेशन में हमने बात की कमर्शियलाइजेशन और प्राइवेटाइजेशन, निजीकरण और बाजारीकरण जो शिक्षा का है उसके ऊपर। हालांकि ये कोई बहुत नई चीज नहीं है, मगर खास करके जो न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी है उसके बाद क्या बदलाव आए हैं और इस जितना ज्यादा निजीकरण की हम तरफ देख रहे हैं उससे एजुकेशन के ऊपर क्या प्रभाव पड़ता है इन अ डाइवर्स कंट्री लाइक इंडिया, उसके ऊपर पहले सेशन में हमने साथियों से सुना। दूसरे सेशन में हमने बात की कि कैसे कोविड महामारी के सिचुएशन में एजुकेशन पे किस तरह का प्रभाव पड़ा है, स्पेसिफिकली given the fact that we have students coming from very many castes, classes, genders, and in such a diverse minority groups, in such a diverse classroom space, किस तरह से COVID ने impact किया on the accessibility of education as well as the experience of education। और तीसरे सत्र में, जो पिछला सत्र था, उसमें हमने बात किया इंस्टीट्यूशनल वायलेंस और डिस्क्रिमिनेशन के बारे में, संस्थागत ढांचागत हिंसा के बारे में, और किस तरह से अलग अलग तबके के लोग एजुकेशनल एक्सपीरियंस में तरह तरह की हिंसा का सामना करते हैं, उससे किस तरह से रेजिस्ट भी करते हैं और उसमें किस तरह के बदलाव लाने की जरूरत है। तो आज का जो सत्र है वो स्पेसिफिकली हम डेडिकेट कर रहे हैं ऑन पर्सपेक्टिव्स ऑन पेडागॉजी इन हायर एजुकेशन। पेडागॉजी, नाउ दिस इज नॉट एन एरिया जो बहुत ज्यादा मेरे क्या कह सकते हैं एक्सपर्टीज का एरिया नहीं है, मगर मैं ये जरूर कहूंगी कि एक जो क्लासरूम स्पेस होता है और द टीचिंग लर्निंग एक्सपीरियंस, इट इज एन इनहेरेंटली पॉलिटिकल एक्ट। द रिलेशन बिटवीन द टीचर एंड द स्टूडेंट, द रिलेशन बिटवीन स्टूडेंट्स, एज वेल एज द रिलेशन बिटवीन द space of a classroom with the society as well as with the state, all of these are very, very political relations. And in a space, in a situation where the students as well as the teachers come from some come from backgrounds which have been historically sometimes excluded from education completely, उसमें ये जो संबंध है एक एजुकेटर का और एक स्टूडेंट का या एक एजुकेशनल स्पेस का स्टेट के साथ, वो बहुत ही हायरार्की और पावर से जुड़ा हुआ स्पेस है। तो ऐसे में उस स्पेस को जो टीचिंग लर्निंग का तरीका है उसके द्वारा किस तरह से मोर एक्सेसिबल बनाया जा सकता है, किस तरह से मोर इंक्लूसिव बनाया जा सकता है, ये इसका एक आयाम है पेडागॉजिकल पर्सपेक्टिव्स का। और खास करके जब हम आजकल जो कोविड की लहर में हम ऐसा देख रहे हैं कि जैसे ही कोविड महामारी हमारे सामने आई, हमने तुरंत अपना जो फोकस है वो डिजिटाइजेशन की तरफ बदल दिया, rather than पेडागोजाइजेशन जैसे कह सकते हैं, या फिर पेडागोजी को किस तरह से बदला जाए, एवैल्यूएशंस को, टीचिंग एक्सपीरियंस को, मार्किंग को, वो सबको बदलने की बजाय हमने एक यूनिडायरेक्शनली बस एक मतलब ब्लाइंडली बस डिजिटाइजेशन की तरफ जोर दिया। तो उसका भी क्या प्रभाव पड़ा। और एज अ सोशल साइंस रिसर्चर माई सेल्फ, एक चीज जो मैं देखती हूँ कि मतलब ये छोटी छोटी मैं चीजें बस ऐसे रख दे रही हूँ इससे पहले कि मैं अपने मॉडरेटर को इनवाइट करूँ। एक जो तीसरी चीज मैं एक ये देखती हूँ कि स्पेसिफिकली इन करंट न्यू लिबरल एनवायरनमेंट वेयर एजुकेशन is such a commodity, where research has been commoditized to such an extent where the researcher is constantly pressured to churn out papers, take out grants, jahan pe you no longer have the space to become a critical thinker as you are supposed to be as a researcher. Rather, you are someone who has to constantly एक प्रोडक्ट है जो आपको वो प्रोडक्ट को प्रोड्यूस करके मार्केट में फटाफट से दे देना है. तो ये सारी समस्याएं हमारे सामने आते हैं और ये बहुत ज्यादा इम्पैक्ट करते हैं ऑन हाउ टीचिंग एंड लर्निंग आर फैसिलिटेटेड इन अ क्लासरूम स्पेस. तो इन मुद्दों पर हमारे साथ डिटेल में बातचीत करने के लिए और कुछ इनसे इसके जो अलग अलग आयाम है उन पे प्रकाश डालने के लिए हमारे साथ हमारे 3 साथी आज मौजूद हैं. हमारे साथ युवान है, स्वाति है और सायंतन है. और एज मॉडरेटर और अपने खुद के विचार हमारे साथ रखने के लिए हमारे पास माया है. मैं छोटा सा इंट्रोडक्शन माया का दे देती हूँ. लेट मी इंट्रोड्यूस माया टू यू, हु इज ऑल्सो आवर मॉडरेटर एंड वुड ऑल्सो बी शेयरिंग हर इनसाइट्स विद अस रिगार्डिंग द पेडागोजिकल इश्यूज इन हायर एजुकेशन. Maya teaches history at the University of Delhi. She is a labor activist and is also associated with the women's organization Center for Struggling Women. Her areas of interest include India's education policy of the late colonial and post-colonial period, heightened inequalities triggered by lockdown, as well as India's labor laws. So without taking any more time, I would invite Maya to take over the space and facilitate the session ahead. Over to you, Maya.
I warmly welcome today's 3 speakers and the audience for this 4th segment of the NAPM hosted Yuva Samvad series on equitable education for all. जैसे कि बताया गया, शिवा ने समझाया कि आज का जो चौथा सेगमेंट है इस सीरीज में उसका एक पर्टिकुलर फोकस है, एक मुद्दा केंद्र में है और वो है एम्पावरिंग पर्सपेक्टिव्स ऑन पेडागोजी इन द हायर एजुकेशन सेक्टर. तो वो विचार, वो अप्रोच पेडागोजी को लेकर खासकर कि हायर एजुकेशन सेक्टर में जो ज्यादा इंक्लूजन, जो ज्यादा बदलाव और इक्वालिटी पैदा कर सके इस सेक्टर में. तो ये है आज का मेन थीम, सेंट्रल इशू, सेंट्रल फोकस. आई रिपीट, एम्पावरिंग पर्सपेक्टिव्स ऑन पेडागोजी इन द हायर एजुकेशन सेक्टर. Now this is a broad theme anchored on what I see as the moderator, concerns regarding greater access to higher education, greater equality and enhanced quality of education also. तो ये जो थीम है, जाहिर सी बात है, इस चीज पे, इन सवालों पर टिका हुआ है कि आप हायर एजुकेशन में, मतलब कॉलेज के एजुकेशन में आप ज्यादा इक्वालिटी कैसे ला सकते हैं, ठीक है, ज्यादा लोगों को कॉलेज एजुकेशन तक कैसे पहुंचा सकते हैं, और आप कॉलेज एजुकेशन की जो परंपरा है, इसकी जो क्वालिटी है, उसको और बढ़ाया कैसे जा सकता है. I thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this Yuva Samvad and also to moderate this very important discussion. Let me introduce our speakers and then proceed with laying the field for today's discussion. I will, of course, say a bit more about each of the speakers when I invite them a little later and ask them to speak and share their views. For now, let me please briefly introduce them to everyone. We are happy to have with us Yuvan. Yuvan is a writer, he's a naturalist, he's an educator, and working with largely, school children, younger children, and he's based in Chennai. He has an interesting investment and take on curriculum development, which is child-centric and also more environmentally conscious driven. But we'll come back with more information on Yuvan and of course to hear him. I also would warmly welcome Swati, who is pursuing her research at the University of Sydney. And she is working with a very important platform known as the Kalingamitra Trust, which has pledged itself to fight against oppression and injustice, particularly by facilitating the education of marginalized groups. Our third, resource person who will be part of this discussion is Sayantan, who is a faculty member at Krea University. Again, as I said, I will introduce more about Sayantan and hand over the floor to them in a couple of minutes. Let me proceed with, as I said, just laying the field. थोड़ा सा मैं अगर आज के डिस्कशन के कुछ दायरे अगर फिक्स कर पाऊं और उसके बाद हम फिर हर रिसोर्स पर्सन के व्यूज और उनके जो इनिशिएटिव्स हैं उनके बारे में और जानने की कोशिश करेंगे. I would just like to begin with laying the field with some remarks and facts, as well as I would just like to table certain appeals that I wish to make before this audience. As we deliberate on transformative, more inclusive, more dynamic pedagogy in higher education, it is necessary to recognize, I feel, the crippling context and crushing inequalities in the education sector, because they shape these inequalities, this larger unequal context shapes the thrust of mainstream pedagogical practices which we are using today and which we have problems with, and B, because the larger inequality shapes the extent to which alternative, more empowering pedagogies can even be enforced and generalized. तो कहने का मतलब ये है कि कुछ हम फैक्ट्स, कुछ हम रियलिटीज के साथ आज डिस्कशन को शुरू करना चाहते हैं. ये ऐसे रियलिटीज हैं, ये ऐसा यथार्थ है जो इन चीजों को एक बहुत महत्वपूर्ण तरीके से तय करता है कि टीचर स्टूडेंट के बीच में या स्टूडेंट और क्लासरूम या स्टूडेंट या कॉलेज के बीच में जो रिश्ता है वो कैसा होगा, और जो जिसका मेन स्ट्रीम एक मेन स्ट्रीम रिलेशनशिप या एक मेन स्ट्रीम एक रिश्ता जो हमें देखने को मिलता है स्टूडेंट टीचर के बीच में, स्टूडेंट क्लासरूम के बीच में, स्टूडेंट कॉलेज के बीच में, वो मेन स्ट्रीम जो एक रिश्ता है उसमें बहुत सारी खामियां हैं, उसमें बहुत सारी दिक्कतें हैं और वो उस यथार्थ से जुड़ी हुई हैं, उस क्रिपलिंग लार्जर कॉन्टेक्स्ट से जुड़ा हुआ है इनइक्वालिटी इन एजुकेशन. दूसरी बात जिसकी वजह से हमें इस यथार्थ को नहीं भूलना चाहिए, उसको अपने डिस्कशन में रखना चाहिए, इसको उसका एक बहुत केंद्रित स्तर है इस डिस्कशन में, सेंट्रल रोल इन दिस डिस्कशन, क्योंकि वो जो यथार्थ है इनइक्वालिटी का एजुकेशन में वो बहुत साफ साफ हमारे ऑल्टरनेटिव पेडागोजीज किस हद तक हासिल हो पाएंगे उस चीज को भी तय करता है. Now this means that efforts at restructured learner-centric pedagogy and curriculum framing within higher education are, I see them as almost unsustainable, these efforts, if we leave unaddressed the question of greater physical inclusion in terms of numbers of youth, Yuva, from poor peasant households, from working class backgrounds, from Dalit, Adivasi communities, or generally speaking, until we are able to clinch this question of the greater physical inclusion of what we call the socially and economically vulnerable segment of youth, first generation learners very often, the question of how successful transformative pedagogies will materialize gets determined. Now at this point I am reminded of a crucial concern articulated from within the radical quarters of the non-Brahmin movement way back in the 19th century. और इन बातों को आपके सामने रखते समय मुझे 19वीं शताब्दी के नॉन ब्राह्मण मूवमेंट से निकलती हुई एक बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण सवाल और एक बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण चेतना की याद आती है, और वो है ज्योतिबा फुले. I'm speaking of Jyotiba Phule, who, in his numerous important representations to the colonial government and in his various revolutionary writings, argued that, the labor, hard work of the oppressed and the exploited Dalit Bahujan produces the wealth of society. But it was not this large section, in fact, majority section of society that benefited back. Rather, it was the dominant class and the upper classes who monopolized society's educational resources, not just wealth, but in particular the educational resources of the society. Now, by recalling Phule, I hope to drive home the point henceforth that very little has changed till now, and Phule's concerns remain therefore relevant even today. In the middle of our discussions, we can draw a lot from the concern that he articulated. Now, why do I say this? And why do I expect that in the life stories that Swati, for example, will be tracing for us of Dalit women students, we will be confronted with the back-breaking challenges that such youth face in their struggles to enter the hallowed realm of universities. Now, why am I saying? मैं फूले की एक बात को याद इस तौर पे कर रही थी अभी कि फूले 19वीं शताब्दी में अपने लेखों में इस चीज का जिक्र कर रहे हैं कि समाज की पूंजी, समाज का वेल्थ कौन पैदा करता है? वो बहुसंख्यक हिस्सा जिसको हम दलित बहुजन कहते हैं, जिसकी मेहनत से, जिसके श्रम, खून पसीने से वो समाज के रिसोर्सेज बनते हैं, लेकिन समाज उनको वापस क्या देता है? शिक्षा का क्षेत्र ही देख लीजिए, शिक्षा मोनोपोलाइज्ड है, शिक्षा पर पूरा कंट्रोल है आपके उच्च जातियों के, आपके दमन करने वाले जातियों के और उच्च वर्ग के. तो क्या ये गैर बराबरी खत्म हुई है? हम तो 19वीं शताब्दी फूले के समय की बात कर रहे हैं. नहीं खत्म हुई है, क्योंकि वही इनइक्वालिटी परसिस्ट करते हुए दिखने को मिल रहा है, कंटिन्यू करते हुए दिख रहा है हमें आज के 21वीं शताब्दी में. Now I draw attention to the hollowness of current claims of access, equity, and quality that resonate from government campaigns and policy documents to further elaborate on what I'm saying, and why I'm saying that the inequality is very concrete and it is persisting, and it is affecting the success or the possibility of alternative student-teacher relationship and pedagogies to evolve and to get generalized. And here I would just like to draw your attention quickly to the dual education system that has existed for a long time, even post-independence. It's an inequality that is bred from KG to PG, as we say. मैं आपका ध्यान दोहरी शिक्षा नीति और दोहरी शिक्षा व्यवस्था की तरफ खींचना चाहती हूँ, जो स्कूल के केजी के सालों से लेकर ऊपर जाके पीजी, पोस्ट ग्रेजुएट लेवल तक हमें वो दोहरी शिक्षा व्यवस्था दिखती है, और उससे निकलता हुआ एक बहुत ही गहरा इनइक्वालिटी या आपको continuous reproduction of inequality दिखता है. Now, the reality is that a very large majority of our children, India's children, they are forced into very poorly run, very poorly managed government schools. मुझे ये कहने की जरूरत नहीं है, बहुत लोग यहाँ पे रवीश कुमार का शो देखते होंगे. रवीश कुमार ने कुछ साल पहले अपने एक शो में ये दिखाया था कि कैसे आप सरकारी स्कूल में जाएंगे बिहार जैसे रीजन में, पटना के 30-40 किलोमीटर की दूरी पर, बिहार की राजधानी पटना के 30-40 किलोमीटर की दूरी पर एक गवर्नमेंट स्कूल में क्लासरूम में, एक ही क्लासरूम में तीसरी या चौथी कक्षा के बच्चे पढ़ाए जा रहे हैं. एक ब्लैक बोर्ड है, 2 टीचर हैं. ब्लैक बोर्ड को डिवाइड कर दिया गया है आधे हिस्से में तीसरी क्लास का गणित सिखाया जा रहा है, दूसरे साइड में चौथी क्लास का गणित सिखाया जा रहा है. तो इस किस्म के शिक्षा, इस किस्म की व्यवस्था, गवर्नमेंट स्कूल की व्यवस्था में एक बड़ा हिस्सा पढ़ता है और बहुत बार अपनी स्कूली शिक्षा खत्म नहीं कर पाता है। और हमें ये भी पता पता है कि ऐसे भी बहुत सारे स्कूल हैं सरकार के जो बंद किए जा रहे हैं, जहाँ पर बहुत बार टीचर नहीं होती या एक ही टीचर होती है, एक ही क्लासरूम होता है। और ये जो व्यवस्था है, ज़ाहिर-सी बात है, कोई आइंस्टाइन या कोई न्यूटन को पैदा नहीं करी। और इस गैर बराबरी को हम बढ़ते हुए देखते हैं, कंटिन्यूअसली देखते हैं। जब तक हम 12वीं तक पहुँचते हैं, एक बड़ा हिस्सा तो स्कूल से निकल भी जाता है, 12वीं तक पहुँचता नहीं है। परंतु अगर हम 12वीं तक पहुँचते भी हैं, तो हमें देखने को मिलता है कि एक बड़ा हिस्सा भारत के युवक की 13वीं हो जाती है। आपको पता है कि हिंदू ट्रेडिशन में ये एक रस्म है, जो मतलब डेथ के बाद 13वें दिन का एक सिग्निफिकेंस है। 13वीं हो जाती है इन द सेंस कि वो कॉलेज तक नहीं पहुँचते हैं, 12वीं में घटिया गवर्नमेंट स्कूल सिस्टम से निकल कर उनको वो मार्क्स नहीं मिलते, जिसके तहत वो कट ऑफ में आ सके या बड़े-बड़े सरकारी कॉलेज में या बड़े-बड़े प्राइवेट कॉलेज में पहुँच सके। तो उस दौर में मैं कह रही हूँ उनकी 13वीं हो जाती है। वो छोटे-छोटे काम या प्राइवेट में किसी जगह कोचिंग या कुछ कोर्स-वोर्स पढ़ने की कोशिश करते हैं और वही उनकी ज़िंदगी बन जाती है। वो उसी हिसाब से कम वेतन पे काम करने लगते हैं और अपनी ज़िंदगी को उस तरीके से बदल नहीं पाते। Now, my concern is that this inequality, fueled by dual education, that starts from school and goes right up, into the higher levels of education, this inequality needs to be aggressively exposed. I mean, all of us need to ask, the journey, the problem begins where, and when it's beginning at the level of schooling, at the level of schooling in terms of inclusion, actual concrete physical inclusion, and sustenance of people within the education system, that's where the problem is starting, then what has happened to the demand for common schooling? वो common school का जो एक नारा है, उसकी क्या स्थिति आज है और वो संघर्ष कहाँ तक पहुंचा है? And here, as an activist working amongst, workers and not just amongst, the most organized section of the workers, but working amongst the least organized sections of workers, and hence the most vulnerable section of India's working class, domestic workers, and other migrant labor with no rights under India's labor laws. That from that segment of society, from bottom up, if you look, I find it deeply problematic that even in activist circles, the critique, on education policy is anchored less firmly, less strongly on the systemic inequality that is bred by the dual school education system. And instead, the critique is more vocal, more articulate against the inequality in the higher education sector. That is in terms of continuously exposing and talking about and criticizing the limited number of public funded universities, the push towards autonomous colleges, high college fees, the growth of private universities, policies supporting foreign university campuses in India, etc. Now, this disbalance in the critique itself, in the discourse of activist circles, is perhaps because many among us have got accustomed to private schooling and have taken for granted the advantages and privileges that correspondingly we gain when we take that kind of heavyweight education from private schools with us, compete, and then get into the best government funded universities and colleges. Now, मैं बस यही कहने की कोशिश कर रही थी कि जो दोहरी शिक्षा नीति है, वो इस तौर पे एक बहुत महत्वपूर्ण यथार्थ है, परंतु बहुत बार हमारे एक्टिविस्ट सर्कल में जितनी इसकी आलोचना होनी चाहिए, उतनी आलोचना या इतनी तीव्र आलोचना नहीं दिखती है। कॉमन स्कूल का नारा बहुत ज़्यादा पुश नहीं होता है और ज़्यादा हायर एजुकेशन सेक्टर में जो कॉलेज के लेवल पे जो प्रॉब्लम है, जैसे कॉलेजेस का निजीकरण, हाई कॉलेज फीस, ऐसी चीज़ों पे ज़्यादा बात होती है। लेकिन ये फंडामेंटल जो सवाल है कि दोहरी शिक्षा, स्कूली शिक्षा को खत्म करना है, कॉमन स्कूल बनाना है, सब लोग एक ही किस्म के स्कूल में पढ़ें, ताकि सब लोग कम से कम उनकी स्टार्टिंग लाइन सबके लिए सेम है जब वो कॉलेज एजुकेशन या हायर एजुकेशन तक पहुँचे। तो ये वाला जो एक डिसबैलेंस है क्रिटिसिज्म में, एक्टिविस्ट सर्कल में भी, इसको भी कहीं ना कहीं एक्सपोज करना, रिकग्नाइज करके एक्सपोज करना बहुत जरूरी है। Now, why did I pick up on this point of dual schooling or dual education? Is because of the undeniable connection between inequality, which starts at the school level, and the non-entry into higher education of a large number of our country's youth. I already gave you that analogy of 13वीं 12वीं के बाद एक बड़ा हिस्सा भारत का बच्चों का 13वीं हो जाता है. We have a gross enrollment ratio in our country. Latest figures for 2018-19 say it's around 26-27%. That means हर 100 युवाओं में जो 12वीं पास करते हैं, सिर्फ 26 से 27 युवा कॉलेज या यूनिवर्सिटी तक एनरोल हो पाते हैं. दैट्स व्हाई हमारा ग्रॉस एनरोलमेंट रेशियो कुछ 26 से 27% है. न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी का एक बहुत ही बड़ा प्रोपेगेंडा चल रहा है कि वो 26-27% को 50% बना लेगा. झूठा आश्वासन है, क्योंकि ज्यादातर सरकार जो है आपके ओपन और डिस्टेंस लर्निंग, आपके ऑनलाइन लर्निंग, आपके जिसको हम इनफॉर्मल एजुकेशन की बात करते हैं, वहां पर एक बड़े हिस्से भारत को पढ़ाना चाहता है. उनको टीचर, क्लासरूम, किताब नहीं देना चाहता है, और इसलिए उस तौर पे डिस्टेंस लर्निंग में उनकी संख्या दिखाकर ये शो करेंगे कि देखो भारत का बड़ा हिस्सा, कम से कम 50% अब कॉलेज जाता है. आप खुद जानते हैं कि कॉलेज जाने का मतलब ये नहीं है कि आप किसी कंप्यूटर या फोन में, मोबाइल फोन में जिस चीज का डर है कि बैटरी खत्म हो जाएगी या डेटा खत्म हो जाएगा, उस जैसे माहौल में, उस जैसी व्यवस्था में आप कॉलेज की पढ़ाई नहीं कर सकते. आपको टीचर, क्लासरूम, आपको बाकी चीजों की सुविधा चाहिए होती है. परंतु ये प्लान नहीं है, ये गेम प्लान नहीं है. हम इस चीज पे और बात भी कर सकते हैं, बट बेसिकली मेरा कहने का ये मतलब है कि एक बड़ा हिस्सा भारत का 12वीं के बाद या तो खराब प्राइवेट यूनिवर्सिटीज, प्राइवेट इंस्टीट्यूट्स में कुछ कोर्स करता है, या सरकारी यूनिवर्सिटीज, गवर्नमेंट फंडेड पब्लिक यूनिवर्सिटीज के बैडली रन, फंड स्टार्व्ड ओपन एंड डिस्टेंस लर्निंग इंस्टीट्यूट्स में एनरोल होते हैं. नाउ दिस इज द रियलिटी, ये यथार्थ है जो हमें समझना होगा, रिकग्नाइज करना होगा, और फिर हमें स्ट्रैटेजीज की बात करनी पड़ेगी आगे के रास्ते का. Now, I want to just flag a couple of more points and realities. What I'm trying to get at is that, it's not that when we look at the higher education sector, when we look at the dynamics of student-teacher relationship, when we look at the dynamics, of the student and, the university, that pedagogical arena or domain of issues, I want to link it up to this very important concern in question, that it's not just that all these dynamics are somewhere getting exposed for their problems because of the privatization of public funded universities. It's not कि मतलब pedagogies खराब हैं, वो और भी expose हो रहे हैं क्योंकि अब पब्लिक यूनिवर्सिटीज को प्राइवेटाइज किया जा रहा है. तो प्राइवेटाइजेशन एक बहुत बड़ी समस्या है. इट्स नॉट सच आई डोंट थिंक द रियलिटी और द प्रॉब्लम बिफोर अस इज सो सिंपल. इट्स नॉट जस्ट द थ्रेट ऑफ रैपिड privatization of public funded universities, but it's the bitter irony and reality that we need to recognize that public funded universities themselves, JNU, DU, Jamia, many other universities considered centers of excellence, have never been inclusive spaces of learning. In fact, they have been exclusive. They have had limited seats over which there's been intense competition. Competition has increased to such an extent that now we have cutoffs that are touching 100% for certain courses. Now, what we find is also in the same public funded universities where the situation has been pathetic for a long time, they have been exclusive and not included a large number of of the country's youth, is also reflected in the very problematic, very compromised reservation policy implementation when it comes to admissions in these universities, when it comes to job recruitment. तो मैं ये कहने की कोशिश कर रही हूँ कि मामला सिर्फ इस बात तक सीमित नहीं है कि निजीकरण की दौर में, ठीक है, निजीकरण की दौर में जहाँ पे हमारे पब्लिक फंडेड यूनिवर्सिटीज को प्राइवेटाइज किया जा रहा है, उनको ऑटोनमस होने का पूरा उन पे दबाव डाला जा रहा है, और उसमें स्टूडेंट टीचर रिलेशनशिप को कैसे बचा कर रखना है. सवाल इतना सिंपल नहीं है. क्योंकि जिन यूनिवर्सिटीज को बचाने की बात की जा रही है वो यूनिवर्सिटीज पहले से इतनी एक्सक्लूसिव थे, पहले से उन्होंने इतने लोगों को बाहर रखा, तो हमें वो सवाल भी तो एड्रेस करना है ना। अगर हमें ऑल्टरनेटिव्स की बात करनी है, एक ऑल्टरनेटिव टेरेन को चार्ट आउट करना है, तो हमें इस चीज को तो इंगित करना ही है कि पहले से स्थिति बहुत खराब थी और वो अब बदतर होने वाली है। पहले से क्यों खराब थी? क्योंकि लिमिटेड सीट्स थे हमारे पब्लिक फंडेड यूनिवर्सिटीज में, रिजर्वेशन पॉलिसी अच्छे से इम्प्लीमेंट नहीं होता था, और कंपटीशन तो इतना ज्यादा हो गया है क्योंकि उसमें क्या होता है कि सीट्स कम है, एक सीट के लिए 100 बच्चे ट्राई कर रहे हैं, और जाहिर सी बात है उस रेस में कौन से बच्चे बाहर हो जाते हैं? वो बच्चे जो आपके जनरली फर्स्ट जनरेशन लर्नर हैं, जो गवर्नमेंट स्कूलिंग से आए हैं, जो सोशली मार्जिनलाइज्ड इकोनॉमिकली वनरेबल सेगमेंट्स ऑफ सोसाइटी के हैं। So clearly, decades after attaining independence, this country has continued to reproduce widespread socioeconomic inequality through a deeply hierarchical and very segmented education system. Because where you enter the education system and from where and at what stage of the structure you exit from largely determines your place in the job market. So that's why I'm saying a segmented education system is continuously reproducing a wider socioeconomic inequality. आप जहां कौन से स्कूल से पढ़ के गए हैं, कॉलेज में जा पा रहे हैं, नहीं जा पा रहे हैं, कॉलेज की पढ़ाई खत्म कर पा रहे हैं नहीं, कौन सी कॉलेज में गए हैं, वो सारी चीजों को आगे तय करता है कि आपको किस टाइप की नौकरी मिलेगी और आपका वेतन कितना होगा, और इस तौर पे कि आप अपनी जिंदगी को बदल पाए हैं या वही जो आपकी फैमिली की पहले की स्थिति थी उसी स्थिति में आप बंधे हुए हैं. Now, it is increasingly difficult to defend the better pedagogical practices and structures and demands for inclusion that have evolved over time, as well as I feel it is difficult to defend and to enforce transformative pedagogical practices when such deep structural inequality exists and persists within the education sector. I will elaborate this later in the discussion. This brings me to certain trends that I just wanted to flag. We can again come back to them later in more detail. I wanted to just highlight some trends that we're seeing in the higher education sector. Now in the official discourse, जो गवर्नमेंट सर्कल्स में, गवर्नमेंट सरकारी लोगों के बीच में, ब्यूरोक्रेट्स के बीच में जो बातचीत खूब चल रही है, if you look at that domain of discussion or the policy, discourse, there is actually a bombardment of the entire concept of learner-centric education, learner-centric pedagogy. आप न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी डॉक्यूमेंट 2020 को खोल के देख लीजिए, न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी डॉक्यूमेंट के 2019 के ड्राफ्ट वर्जन को खोल के देख लीजिए, ध्यान से पढ़िएगा, और ये डॉक्यूमेंट्स के हिंदी वर्जन्स भी हैं, आपको दिखिएगा भाई, गिन सकते हैं आप कितनी कितनी बार ये शब्द लर्नर सेंट्रिक इस्तेमाल हुआ है. मतलब हर दूसरे पेज में लर्नर सेंट्रिक डाल दिया हमने. अब हमारे लिए जब हम यहाँ पे इस गोष्ठी में, इस युवा संवाद में एक्चुअली हम इस बात से कंसर्न है कि लर्नर की क्या स्थिति है, लर्नर का कितना एम्पावरमेंट होता है, लर्नर एजुकेटर के बीच में क्या रिलेशनशिप है, हमें बहुत सावधान रहना पड़ेगा कि कहीं ना कहीं हमारे कंसर्न्स को कैसे कोऑप्ट किया जा रहा है, कैसे उसको एक दूसरा रूप दिया जा रहा है, एक उसको मिसयूज किया जा रहा है. और एक्चुअली इन द ऑफिशियल डिस्कोर्स यू कैन सी दिस मिसयूज ऑफ genuine concerns about, the inequalities that many learners are trapped in. It's being misused, and there's this entire policy discourse about, promoting learner-centric pedagogy and education. There's a whole lot of, bombardment on this whole concept of multidisciplinarity. Children should be educated, young people should be educated in all disciplines, right? उनको थोड़ा सा ये भी पता होना चाहिए, थोड़ा सा ये भी पता होना चाहिए, थोड़ा सा ये भी पता होना चाहिए, सारे डिसिप्लिन्स का कुछ ना कुछ उनको समझा देना चाहिए. Multiple pathways of learning, another concept in the official policy discourse, which is, again being bombarded. We are being bombarded with this. That basically means that there is different ways in which a learner can learn. Okay, so there can be direct classroom teaching, right? Like in our universities, higher education sector की बात करें तो 5 days a week या 6 days a week classroom में आप आते हैं, टीचर आती हैं और आपको पढ़ाया जाता है, वो तो फॉर्मल रेगुलर फॉर्म ऑफ लर्निंग है. परंतु नहीं, उसके अलावा दूसरे फॉर्म ऑफ लर्निंग है जो एज एम्पावरिंग हो सकते हैं, जैसे कि आप ऑनलाइन में पढ़ लीजिए, जैसे आप दूर से पढ़ लीजिए, पत्रचार माध्यम से पढ़ लीजिए, ये सारे माध्यम एक है, आप सीख लेंगे। अब ये तो कहीं ना कहीं एक असर्शन लगता है, कोई गारंटी नहीं लगता है। And so these are the kind of, I just wanted to caution us, these are the important concepts which are filtered and have been part of the policy discourse. It reflects a flirting with genuine problems and concerns which are being articulated by educationalists, by ordinary people, and we need to be careful of how we strategize given this co-option, given this flirting with concerns, with concepts that is happening by the policymakers. Let me for now just take the issue of learner-centric pedagogy and curriculum revisions that are reflected in the recent policy documents. Now, these are policy documents or the contents of the official discourse that exists within education bureaucracy. UGC वालों के बातों में, डॉक्यूमेंट्स में दिखता है, बाकी अलग अलग कमिटियां सरकार बैठाती है, उनके पेपर्स में ये सारी बातें हमें दिखती हैं, खास करके लर्नर सेंट्रिक पेडागोजी और करिकुलम रिवीजन। करिकुलम को रिवाइज करो भाई, ये करिकुलम नहीं चलेगा, हमें अप टू डेट और ऐसा करिकुलम चाहिए जो बच्चों को, जिससे बच्चों को फायदा होगा। जैसे कि करिकुलम पहले बच्चों का कोई फायदा ही नहीं कर रहा था। परहैप्स देन द अल्टरनेटिव, द ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव पेडागोजी, आई फील, so basically I'm saying that, if we look at the policy discourse that is, bombarding us with these, learner-centric pedagogy concept, curriculum revisions, I think it's important to, recognize that official discourse and the dangers that come with it, because that is one perspective that we must engage with during this discussion. I feel when we engage with that official discourse, then perhaps the alternative, the transformative pedagogy can be distinguished more meaningfully. So the talk of learner-centric education, I see it as a guise for, passing on the bulk of the cost of higher education onto the individual learner. ठीक है, जो भी पॉलिसी डॉक्यूमेंट, पॉलिसी डिस्कोर्स में लर्नर सेंट्रिक एजुकेशन, लर्नर सेंट्रिक पेडागोजी का प्रमोशन हो रहा है, वो बेसिकली एक तरीका है, इस सरकार और पहले के सरकारों का भी एक तरीका है, जिसके जरिए वो एजुकेशन के कॉस्ट को इंडिविजुअल लर्नर पर ट्रांसफर कर सके। तो सरकार को per capita allocation of funds of the government has actually seen a decline. Per capita allocation of funds for education has seen a decline, and the CAG reports of various time periods have shown that the education cess, the tax that we pay towards education as citizens of this country, most of it is lying unutilized or used wastefully for propaganda campaigns like Beti Padhao Beti, all these other campaigns. And the real infrastructure that is needed to facilitate equality is not being invested in. So there's a decline per capita allocation of funds by the state, and this means that at the same time, when you're talking about combine it with the learner-centric campaign, it means से हम स्टेट से हम विड्रॉ कर रहे हैं, स्टेट विड्रॉ कर रहा है, आपको पढ़ना, आपको सीखना है, ऑनलाइन पढ़ लो और उसका खर्चा आप उठा लो। एक बार ही तो कंप्यूटर खरीदना है, एक बार ही तो स्मार्टफोन खरीदना है, डेटा पैक तो मतलब मैनेज हो जाएगा, यहाँ पे आ जाओ, यहाँ पे वाईफाई मिल जाएगा। So you can see actually it's a guise for passing on the bulk of the education cost onto the individual learner. And we're seeing this in the form of the proliferation of online courses, digitization of course material. Digitization of course material, मैं हैरान हूँ आपके ऐसे इंस्टीट्यूशंस में जहाँ पे सबसे गरीब बच्चे आते हैं, माइनॉरिटीज से आती हैं, लड़कियां बड़ी संख्या में पढ़ रही हैं, दलित परिवारों से हैं, गरीब हैं। मैं अपनी खुद की यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ दिल्ली की बात करें, इसका एक बहुत बड़ा 5 लाख बच्चे स्कूल ऑफ ओपन लर्निंग, डिस्टेंस लर्निंग, पत्रचार माध्यम में पढ़ते हैं यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ दिल्ली में। मैं हैरान हूँ, बार बार यूनिवर्सिटी जो है ये गरीब बच्चों को कहता है कि तुम 9-10 क्लास में पढ़ लो, जो अदरवाइज 180 दिन का सिलेबस रेगुलर कॉलेज में पढ़ाया जाता है, तुम 9 क्लास में पढ़ लो, 9 दिन में पढ़ लो, और तुम्हारा सारा मटेरियल ना हम इंटरनेट पे डाल रहे हैं, हम ई पुस्तक द्वार वेबसाइट पे डाल रहे हैं। आप उस वेबसाइट को जाके खोल के देखिए, ई पुस्तक द्वार वेबसाइट, ज्यादातर कंडीशन आपको ये देखिए कि वो वेबसाइट क्रैश हो गया है। आप सोचिए 5 लाख लोग उसमें अपना मटेरियल डाउनलोड करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, क्या होगा? और मटेरियल की स्थिति भी इतनी खराब है। तो ये जो डिजिटाइजेशन ऑफ कोर्स मटेरियल है, ये भी एक तरीका है कि बच्चे, गरीब बच्चे, सबसे गरीब बच्चे मजबूर होंगे कि वो प्रिंट आउट निकालें, इंटरनेट कैफे का खर्चा खुद से उठाएँ या मोबाइल फ़ोन खरीदने के लिए मजबूर हों, इत्यादि, इत्यादि। तो द कॉस्ट इज़ कॉन्स्टेंटली बीइंग शिफ्टेड ऑन द इंडिविजुअल लर्नर. We also see all this, learner-centric education paradigm being anchored on this whole blended learning model. So teach half your course in the physical mode, teach the other half in the online mode. We also see it in the proliferation of edu-tech companies like Unacademy and various other things. Now, this is just I wanted to flag in terms of, how we are seeing the co-option of, certain kinds of ideas and models and their misuse by the regime to promote, a situation where it's the individual learner that's going to bear the cost of education. On curriculum revision, my last few comments on curriculum revision, again, we are seeing this continuous push towards quote unquote, and I'm quoting the UGC, यूनिवर्सिटी ग्रांट्स कमीशन की मैं बात कर रही हूँ, उनका कुछ ही दिन पहले ये डायरेक्टिव आया था सारे सेंट्रल यूनिवर्सिटीज को, भारत में 45 सेंट्रल यूनिवर्सिटीज हैं, कि आप अपने कोर्सेज को रिस्ट्रक्चर कीजिए, आप अपने कोर्सेज को रैशनलाइज कीजिए, स्टूडेंट डिमांड से मैच करना चाहिए। अब ये भी कहीं ना कहीं झलकता है स्टूडेंट या लर्नर सेंट्रिक वो अप्रोच लेकर कह रहे हैं कि जो बच्चे पढ़ना चाहते हैं ना, आप वही कोर्स पढ़ाइए। साथ साथ आपको पॉलिसी डॉक्यूमेंट्स में करिकुलम रिवीजन को लेकर ये दिख रहा है कि अब हम बैचलर्स 3 साल में नहीं 4 साल में कराएंगे, जिसको हम 4 ईयर अंडर ग्रेजुएट प्रोग्राम कहेंगे। और 4 ईयर अंडर ग्रेजुएट प्रोग्राम क्या होगा कि आप 2 साल में भी निकल जाएंगे, आपको एक डिग्री मिलेगी, तीसरे साल में निकल जाएंगे, आपको एक दूसरी डिग्री मिलेगी, चौथे साल पूरे 4 साल की तो आपको एक रिसर्च डिग्री मिलेगी। अब हमारे लिए हमारे मतलब हम एक्टिविस्ट लोगों के लिए ये तो एक चिंता के विषय है। आप मल्टीपल एग्जिट पॉइंट्स और हाथ में डिग्री इस तौर पे दे रहे हैं, जिससे आप ड्रॉप आउट रेट्स को बेसिकली लेजिटिमाइज कर रहे हैं। आपका यूनिवर्सिटी सिस्टम ड्रॉप आउट्स को टैकल नहीं कर पा रहा है, तो वो उसको एक दूसरा नाम देकर कह रहा है तुम ड्रॉप आउट कर लो और तुम्हें जो है हम कुछ सर्टिफिकेट डिग्री दे देंगे, अगर तुम 2 साल के बाद निकल रहे हो, 3 साल के बाद निकल रहे हो तो आपको ये डिग्री दे देंगे। आप ड्रॉप आउट क्यों हो रहा है एक बड़े हिस्से का, खास करके हमें पता है वो समाज के कौन से तबके होंगे जो ड्रॉप आउट होते हैं यूनिवर्सिटी से, वो क्यों ड्रॉप आउट हो रहे हैं, उसको तो आप कभी रिजॉल्व नहीं करेंगे। एंड अनदर एस्पेक्ट, basically by pushing for this 4 year undergraduate program, this multiple entry exit point format of curriculum, you're also pushing university systems to dilute their syllabus. And it's very dangerous for the humanities and social sciences that still have a very critical import in terms of their content. So there's a dilution of syllabi, which is very much written into the logic of multiple entry, multiple exit point. आप सोचिए हम किस तरीके का कोर्स बनाएंगे, किस तरीके का हम एक कोर्स बनाएंगे जहाँ पे हमें ये भी लेके चलना है कि देखो कोर्स में जो हम फर्स्ट ईयर में पढ़ाएंगे, उस सेकेंड ईयर में हम कितना कंटिन्यू कर पाएंगे, सेकेंड ईयर में एक हिस्सा बाहर एग्जिट कर लेगा। अब हम सेकेंड ईयर में जो पढ़ाएंगे वो थर्ड ईयर में हम कितना उसको कंटिन्यू कर पाएंगे, कनेक्शन बना पाएंगे, थर्ड ईयर में एक हिस्सा चला गया। तो हम अपने कोर्सेज को भी कैसे, अपने कोर्सेज के क्रिटिकलिटी को भी हम, डिसिप्लिन के क्रिटिकलिटी को भी हम कैसे मेंटेन करेंगे, अगर आप इस किस्म की व्यवस्था बनाएंगे ये झूठा आश्वासन देकर कि बच्चे इससे बेनिफिट होंगे और बच्चे एक्चुअली ये चाहते हैं। Essentially, I see all these trends as a shift towards the dilution of syllabi, the rationalization of courses, a shift towards, pressure, a lobby from private sector employers who are seeking to create a multi-skilled workforce that can be easily moved around, placed within middle-rung, relatively poorly paid jobs, and you create a generation of easy to fire, easy to hire workforce. And of course, private sector employers don't need to spend on training. So that's why the university level itself, you introduce internships as part of the degree, apprenticeship as part of the degree. Not to say that existing syllabi in central universities, this takes me to my conversation on the phone with my colleague Yuvan. Of course, existing syllabi does have its problems, and I, teaching in a central university, would like to agree with these assessments that the central university syllabi very often in history, my history discipline, so history teachers हंसते हैं दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में कि जो दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी अपना एक हिस्ट्री का सिलेबस बनाता है वो पूरे भारत में कट कॉपी पेस्ट हो जाता है। वही सिलेबस पढ़ाया जाएगा बाकी 45 सेंट्रल यूनिवर्सिटीज में। अब ये नहीं देखा जाता कि वो सेंट्रल यूनिवर्सिटी कहाँ उपस्थित है, क्या उस यूनिवर्सिटी को इतना इम्पोर्टेंस एक रीजन को देने की जरूरत है, या वहाँ की हिस्ट्री के बारे में ज्यादा अच्छे से पढ़ाया जाना चाहिए. So obviously that disbalances in the university, current university frameworks of curriculum, we have seen skewed disbalances. But what I'm saying is we are going from bad, very bad, to worse. And I would just end with saying that the thrust of learner-centric approach that we are seeing in the policy framework, I would say that it's combining with these attempts by the right wing to change the syllabi, to change the curriculum in a way in which the critical edge of many disciplines is being blunted, and we are trying to create through the education sector, a very problematic majoritarian view, and a very questionable view of India's history and Indian tradition. The attack on history syllabus in particular, because I'm a historian, so I can quote that example. In the history syllabus, we have seen...
Maya, I'm sorry to intervene. There's a request from the speakers because they've also signed up for other sessions. So,
I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'll just end with this point. Maybe I'll just elaborate
usually
it
we
later.
conclude by 8 o'clock. So if we could just do a round of the speakers and...
Right. So I would just say that curriculum revision has been happening in a dangerous way. That's also a question which we need to link up to the larger policy shift and exclusion that is being envisaged. We can come back to all these issues, and I think the speakers themselves would be elaborating on some of these aspects and responding to them. So let me turn to Yuvan. Yuvan, is a very important resource person for us today. As I mentioned, that he's a writer, he's a naturalist, and his interests include reimagining an earth-centric and child-centric education in schools, and the ground-up processes of change and politics. Now, he writes on topics at the intersection of ecology, education, and
Yuvan is probably not here, Maya. We'll see if we can. He had another meeting at 7, so we'll see if he can be back. So maybe one of the other speakers can come in until then.
So let's ask Swati. Is Swati still online? Okay, so Swati, can you hear us?
Yes.
Swati, I would just like to introduce you and hand over. As I mentioned, Swati is pursuing her PhD from Sidney. She has been a member of the Kalingamitra Trust. Kalingamitra Trust is a social organization guided by the thoughts and philosophies of all revolutionaries who fought against oppression and injustice. The trust provides training, guidance, and support to marginalized students aspiring for higher education, both in India and abroad. Swati, in particular, at an individual level, if you look at her work, her focus is on the education of women, and she works towards that. I request Swati to, share her inputs, her insights. Let's start with perhaps what you could share with us, Swati, about certain life stories that have unfolded of students from marginalized communities, in particular Dalit women students, and their struggles to enter the hallowed realm of higher education. Please, Swati, if you could trace some of those experiences for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's not about only pedagogy, it's also about the curriculum and what we teach in classroom. So that is also very important. Like you were talking about history of marginalized, how history have been erased from the syllabus and in school to higher education system. So what is the relationship between, and what should be the relationship between the teacher and the student? So now I was thinking can we separate our like like our community kind of environment and culture, and like the school and the university environment, like we how we behave. So when we see like our like yeah, particularly my experience, I was thinking before also, like the school level also, like we have to face like the untouchability and midday meal, we need to yeah, even now also student need to sit separately, and there is a kind of upper caste cook always. So see, like the teacher mostly, come from the very dominant upper caste background, and they don't tolerate kind of Dalit cook in the school. So, it's reflect their own, how they behave at home and how they behave and how their culture, So it's always reflect in higher education also. So हम लोग जो अभी बात कर रहे हैं, जैसे कि टीचर अभी स्टूडेंट मोस्टली मार्जिनलाइज्ड दलित स्टूडेंट, दे फेस caste discrimination, exclusions, isolation, and many kind of suicide cases we can see every day coming. So हम कैसे चेंज करेंगे? It's very difficult questions, because you already spoke a lot about kind of pedagogy or practice in the curriculum, the syllabus we have. So we have in India we have like the caste-based society, and highly the kind of patriarchal we have in the system. So हम जब तक ये कास्ट के ऊपर अगर हमको अगर if we need to equal space in education in university level, so we also need to work on our structure, on the social structure. So जब तक ये सोशल स्ट्रक्चर या जो कास्ट बेस्ड स्ट्रक्चर है और जो भी पैट्रियार्कल जो सोसाइटी है, इसके ऊपर हम काम नहीं करेंगे तो फिर यूनिवर्सिटी में आई डोंट नो फिर कैसे ये लागू होगा, क्योंकि व्हाटएवर वी हैव लाइक द इन पेपर्स ओनली, like we have a constitution, very good constitution, but in reality it's nothing. So this is in university also, like we are we have a same kind of the system and the practice. The teacher also practice the same the behavior, the way they practice in their home and their community, and so it's kind of very difficult to imagine. So kind of we have kind of the dominating culture like the home through the university level. So that's actually reflect our society, the university space. So मुझे लगता है कि जैसे कि पहले भी जैसे कि हमारे बहुत सारे लीडर जैसे कि क्वेश्चंस जैसे कि अम्बेडकर को ले सकते हैं, ज्योतिबा फुले, सावित्री बाई फुले, जो उनका एक आर्गुमेंट था, क्योंकि द पेडागोजी में क्योंकि हम लोग अगर मैं आई हैव सम एक्सपीरियंस, माय ओन एक्सपीरियंस, और अगर मैं यूनिवर्सिटी को जाऊंगी और there's always the teacher always they teach about the kind of dominant kind of syllabus curriculum. So sometimes it's not kind of truth, and sometimes, and it's kind of very kind of it's very contradiction to whatever we learn, because I am coming from the social certain, I have certain background, and I was also I know I have yeah, I was a part of yeah, I was a member of I'm sorry so मैं पहले मैं नागपुर में भी थी और एक ट्रेनिंग इंस्टीट्यूट वो था, तो मैं so I have trained in that institute also. I am a member of Kalingamitra Trust. So I have certain perspective to see, the everything. So whenever I am in the classroom and there's some teacher and the teaching of the fall, so I need to questions, and some of the student they dare to questions, and what happened, the teacher, the teacher got their marks, or sometimes the student also they don't dare to question, because they scare if they will speak something, something will happen to them, or yeah, teacher yeah, they've got their marks. So in that situation it's kind of very kind of silence zones. The university is the classroom also. So it's very kind of very dangerous we are going through. So इसीलिए हम लोगों को ये the university को ही focus करना तो I don't think so. तो इसलिए हमको we need to see our social structure and because the mainstream the government or the central government always they are very dominant and they are very dominating and their ideology is very dominating. So it's they always everything controlled by the state. Even the university are not autonomous or not independent to act their own. And even the teacher also mostly kind of 70 80-90% teacher come from like the privileged background, and their mindset always reflect the way they teach and the way they interact the student. So so we need to actually take very radical step on how to work on this. It's not only about the university also kind of, but also our like close environment, because always our background, our our background, our perspective always dominant the university our attitude also. So yeah, the caste and the kind of gender and the patriarchal kind of mindset, we need to work on that first. Then we can bring many laws, because we have many things, kind of many laws, many policy, many curriculum. We are working on the curriculum, but it's not working. It's not benefited to the student because we are not changing our mentality or mindset. So main thing for I was thinking, so we need to change our mentality, or the we have kind of certain caste biasness or like yeah. So we need to actually work on the questions to caste and and how we can bring on the how we can bring marginalized history, how we can teach in that history in the classroom. Then we can imagine we can change something. Otherwise it's kind of very it's very complex and very dominating situation we have, because it's not only about the university, also always the mainstream, always government controlling who are the who is the government here. So it's very kind of dominating. They have the nature, and they have their own agenda to propagate always. So in these situations, uh, everyone I think need to come forward and take actions on like the caste. How can we create a caste based caste-less society? How can we make a equality? How can we practice the equitable educations in classroom? So this is because sometimes the student also hide their identity. There are so many evidence and report have been documented in the research academia. It's found that like the student hide their identity due to this. Maybe they scare because if other people, if their peers will know about their identity, their background, maybe they will feel like they don't know how they will be treated in the future. So this kind of the environment reflect what kind of university, what kind of pedagogy, what kind of curriculum, what kind of teacher we have in the university. So this is kind of very unbelievable. So yeah, so it's actually a great kind of work need to be done in this area, because unless until we not able to the caste system, so it's a very difficult to we can imagine, or the equality in the classroom or university space.
Just a quick question, which perhaps you could elaborate further.
Yeah.
So Swati, Dalit women students, be them in school or Dalit women students who enroll in college, how would you, define, आप किस तरीके से मतलब स्कूल में पढ़ने वाली दलित छात्राएं, कॉलेज में पढ़ने वाली दलित छात्राएं, उनके मुद्दों को कैसे केंद्र में लाया जाए, क्योंकि जाहिर सी बात है वो कास्ट डिस्क्रिमिनेशन के साथ साथ और भी बहुत वनरेबिलिटीज सहती हैं. आई मीन it's a particular situation of caste discrimination that they face, and it's also a gender based inequality that they are confronted with in school, in college. So in terms of that, what are your comments, what are your and what are the new trends that we are seeing amongst Dalit women students, mobilization and resistance?
Yeah, as a being a Dalit women, we have faced like a triple kind of discrimination, like the basis of the caste, basis of the gender, and basis of the economy. So yeah, it's a very kind of struggle to come here in the University of Sydney. It was not easy for me too. So yeah, so it's kind of at the same time they have like so like the family also sometimes they don't support because of the so many reasons, like maybe kind of always the son preference, they like preference their son to go for their educations, and sometimes like coming from the very marginalized background, have to face like the economical the financial crisis. So actually so it's so hard, and when like whenever we manage to come and overcome of the struggle to enter the higher education, so like we have to kind of we are facing kind of caste in the classroom, the university level, and yeah, so many in the language basis also, and sometimes some people don't want to talk to them. So these are the kind of issue the women are facing in education, and the uh, the way to higher education.
Okay, thank you for these initial comments, Swati. We will come back. I'm sure there'll be more comments for you, and you yourself may want to elaborate and clarify many things. I now invite our third resource person. I hope that Sayantan is here still with us online.
I am. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me please introduce now. Sayantan is a queer and trans science journalist. They write at the intersection of science, gender, sexuality, health, and caste. They are a faculty in the Center for Writing and Pedagogy, Krea University, Andhra Pradesh, and are also associated with a pretty dynamic platform, the feminist multimedia science collective, the lifeofscience.com. So I would, request, Sayantan to please share his concerns and his observations with respect to higher education, but any other connections he wishes to wish to make.
Thank you. Thanks, Maya, and of course, pleasure to be here. Because I've primarily studied science almost all my life and only have moved away from it more recently, and continue to write about science. I think I'll keep my comments to my observations on science and science practice in India. And because we're talking about pedagogy, before we come to pedagogy, it's important for us to think about why some people like me have a particular focus on science. And that's because no other country in the world has a fundamental duty to inculcate scientific temper. It's only India in whose constitution we have one of the fundamental duties listed as the inculcation of scientific temper, right? Now, the question then that eventually brings us to is, how do our science classrooms look? What are science classrooms really doing in terms of inculcating scientific temper? And in 1998, I think Sugra Chunawala from the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education, it's an institute in Bombay, Sugra just retired this year, so very much a very active scholar. What they did is administered something called the Draw Scientist test to students, right? So you walk into a school classroom and you just tell them, draw a scientist. However you imagine a scientist to be, just draw a scientist. And a whopping 86.5% of students from both genders, and I'm using both very precariously here because that's what the study says. And we now know that both is probably an incorrect word to use, but whatever, from all genders, we see a whopping 86.5% students drawing scientists who appear to be male. And that was one of the first instances, reports from India, which really brought to us the idea that it's not just the question of representation in a science classroom, how many women students, for example, are able to access a science classroom, but also the fact that the way science is taught and the way science is conveyed to students is itself a method of perpetrating certain kinds of discriminations. For example, all biology textbooks talk about reproduction, for example, and that reproduction chapter is essentially always talking about heterosexual families, right? The sex is linked to childbirth, and childbirth is a result of a heterosexual family. And similarly, when these science classrooms talk about diseases, then HIV/AIDS crops up, and HIV/AIDS is always portrayed as this disease that is perpetrated by queer people in the country, and hence there are certain sex acts that you shouldn't do because they are more prone to committing, more prone to perpetrating stuff like HIV/AIDS, right? So there's both criminalization and the discrimination that's happening in science classrooms through science pedagogy. And therefore, I mean, when I usually make a very strong claim that science itself is an act of violence, and science classroom is the seat of that violence. And so I'm not making it lightly, I'm trying to sort of back it up with this kind of evidence. So in 2016 or so, two women science journalists, Nandita Jairaj and Ashima Freedog, they were both working in science journalism for quite some time. So they had this information that, okay, numbers in terms of representation don't look that bad, at least if you look at 11 and 12, classes 11 and 12, senior secondary school education. In fact, you'll often see 11 and 12 classes having more than 50% students to be women. And similarly, but then when you move up the ladder, right, so you go to undergrad programs, then you go to master's program, postgrad programs, and then you go to the PhD level, then assistant professor, associate professor, professor level. If you're looking at the academic ladder, you see that the attrition level increases exponentially. So from a classroom which has at least 50 to 60% women, suddenly at the undergrad level, you have 30 to 40% women. Then you move to the master's level, you see 20% women. You move to PhDs, 10%. And PhD is particularly interesting because just how many people are pursuing their PhD is not sufficient. You need to look at how many of them complete their PhDs as well. The number drops there. Assistant professors further, associate professor drops further. By the time you reach a professor position, you see that the numbers are abysmal. Particularly, for example, I used to be in this institute called the Datta Institute of Fundamental Research, Hyderabad. And it's one of the sister institutions within this TIFR circle, which is one of the very prestigious science institutions in this country. And among more than 40 faculty at one point of time, there was only one woman faculty who was there in the entire institute. So essentially, when we encounter data like that, the question that automatically arises is what's happening here, right? I mean, how is it that there's no reason for us to believe that women are not inclined to study science, because evidently many of them take up science as a specialty in their 11 and 12. From our work, there's no reason for us to believe that women get disillusioned by science in later careers, because we have found women doing all and every kind of science possible, really. I mean, believe me when I say this. From, like, if you take science, technology, engineering, medicine, and mathematics, and allied disciplines as this broad category, you will find women in every subcategory possible. So what we essentially did is then from 2016, Nandita and Ashima started doing, started what's called the lab hopping journey, where they actually traveled around the entire country to very many science institutions, including institutions of eminence, central universities, private universities, state universities, colleges, and to really talk to women and understand what is the experience that eliminates women. And it's called the leaky pipeline quite frequently. And it's a couple of perspectives that came up. I'm just going to sort of summarize those very briefly. So one thing that came up quite often was the fact that there are multiple roadblocks for women in science, right? So women in science have reported that you have to work twice as hard as your male colleagues. There's an entry-level dismissal of women who are trying to contribute to decision-making in the institute. More importantly, as you move up the ladder to positions which actually have a lot of power, right? So you look at vice chancellors, you look at directors of institute, you look at committees which are governing certain decision-making process, funding agencies. There are barely any women in these positions, and many women scientists have reported not being able to crack through the system because of the lack of women in the decision-making bodies. And some people have also reported not being able to participate in field work as well as their male colleagues would, right? So if I'm a paleontologist who looks at fossils, that means I just have to go and collect rocks, collect fossils. I have to sit with a hammer and a nail and like literally sort of break the fossil. So, and women have said that, okay, we ask permission from the institute. They'll say, why don't you carry a man with you because there's a risk at night, and so on and so forth, right? Then there are, for women in science particularly, there are also questions about maternity and childbirth. So when a woman decides to carry a child and take care of the child, the maternity system in this country is quite oppressive for that matter, because they're given some three months of a leave. Many women scientists have reported that even in those 3 months, they've had to somehow work. They've also reported that in these 3 months, sometimes their salaries are cut and they can't bring their children to their labs. And as a result of this, what we see is that either women take a break from science or they leave science altogether. Now, the point is, so these are some of the very early insights that we had at thelifeofscience.com. And then we started looking at what are the other marginalizations that sort of seem to impact science and science practice in India. And we looked at two other marginalized identities that we've been able to focus a little deeply on, are one on the axis of caste and the other on the axis of gender a little further. So, and thanks to the NALSA judgment of the 2014, almost all educational institutions are under at least some pressure on paper to make themselves appear as if they are welcoming to transgender students. Now, the point is that's not really true in practice, but they at least have to do it on paper. So what I did from 2020, and I've been continuing this work in several steps, is to really reach out to very young students who are pursuing undergrad or postgrad degrees in science, and then also reach out to faculty who are trans-identifying to understand how are their experiences in science looking. And the question of pedagogy there becomes so fundamental, because science, the language of science is extremely cis-heterosexist, cis-heteropatriarchal. You're taught about male and female bodies as if they are natural truths and no other bodies are possible. You're taught about men and women as genders which are naturally embedded, and anything else is different. And for that matter, science is also in its pedagogy forced this discrimination upon people. There are geneticists, Angela Saini, science journalist Angela Saini has reported that leading geneticists in this country actually believe that gender and caste are biologically coded, and they have also said that this is linked to their intelligence. So they've said that, okay, if you're a woman, you're going to be, let's say, better at emotional stuff, but you can't do mathematics. Or if you are a Dalit person, then somehow you cannot do science. There's no point in taking a Dalit person for their PhDs. So we started uncovering these narratives, and what we found is really very scary, very traumatizing. Particularly because, for example, we have heard narratives from Dalit students in science And casteism in science is not new. We're all aware of Rohit Act death by suicide, Aniket Ambore's death by suicide, Fatima Latif's death by suicide, Anita's death by suicide. If we take names, we can sort of go on forever. But to understand how this casteism is perpetuated, you see when these Dalit students enter university campuses, they're not assigned a PhD supervisor, because no PhD supervisor, no Savarna, upper caste, oppressor caste PhD supervisor is interested in working with Dalit Bahujan Adivasi PhD students. And they sometimes waste years of their PhD just looking for a supervisor. Then comes question of productivity, right? So science believes that it's an objective discipline, right? As long as you are able to do your experiments or your fieldwork carefully, use a robust form of analysis, you should come to the same data. And therefore, who you are doesn't matter in science. But this is also an inherent contradiction in science, because, well, on one hand, we believe that science is devoid from identity, and yet science resists marginalized identities like nobody else. On one hand, scientists say we are apolitical, and then when a anti-reservation protest happens, you see IITs and AIMS at the helm of that anti-reservation protest. So, and if you look at numbers are, of course, the worst in IITs and AIMS. So there are several IITs which have only 2 or only 3 Dalit Bahujan Adivasi professors as compared to 200, 300 Savarna professors taking their entire disciplines. And that applies to a place like JNU for that matter. I think 2020 data from JNU shows that at the professor level, there are hardly 2 or 3 professors, while 205 or a little more Savarna professors occupy spaces. Even in central universities like JNU, where the ethos is a little more aware than, let's say, a place like IISc or a place like TIFR. And then when you come to the question of transgender persons, I mean, it's again another really abysmal, traumatic, and scary space, because science teaches you to not believe in identities that lie at borders, that lie at margins. You either have to be male or female, man or women. And then there's a question of how do you navigate that space without appropriate infrastructure and with an oppressive pedagogy? So there's an oppressive pedagogy that systematically eliminates you from the classroom by saying you are invalid, you're diseased, or you're a criminal. And there is infrastructure that disables you from accessing something like a washroom. So how does a transgender person access washrooms in these campuses? How does a transgender person access hostels in these campuses? How does a transgender person access bodies that are built to protect some marginalized identities? For example, the prevention of sexual harassment committees. We call them ICCs these days, whatever we want to call them. These ICCs, the mental health care centers, the healthcare centers in these universities and institutions are not trans sensitive, they are not caste sensitive, which means there's a systematic exclusion of Dalit and transgender persons that happens every day, every moment in a science institution, irrespective of whether science wants to acknowledge it or not. Even if you look at policy, for example, the draft Science Technology Innovation Policy 2020, it's yet to become an act, but it's at this moment, like the National Education Policy has been passed, but the STIP 2020, Science Technology Innovation Policy 2020 remains to be passed. It's a draft policy that was invited for comments in the year 2020. What you see is that it loves to say that we want to build a diverse and inclusive science education system. We want more and more transgender, and transgender, it's a word that it really likes. We really want more and more transgender persons to work in science, but there's not a single tangible action point that the policy mentions that enables transgender persons to access a science institution. Then if you look at, taking the question of pedagogy forward, and very, very recently, we had this manual for transgender sensitive school education that was released by the NCERT, National Council for Education, Research and Training, from the Department of Gender Studies. Now, the manual is overall a fantastic document. There are certain places where one can critique the manual, but it's overall a fantastic document. It was written by queer and transgender persons in collaboration with gender studies scholars and made available on the internet. it does it gets many things right. It offers role models for young transgender students in schools to look up to, because role models in science are Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, both white, cisgender, heterosexual men who've also thrived primarily on power and patriarchy and the genius trope of science, which we have to actively work against. And then the manual also goes on to suggest methods in making, let's say, biology chapters more trans-inclusive. For example, if you're talking about something like biomolecules, molecules that exist within the body, you'll be talking about something like hormones, and that might be a moment to tell possibly trans students or students who are gender non-conforming or students who are questioning their gender and might identify as trans later, that there's an option for you to access puberty blockers, or there's an option for you to access gender affirmative medical practices if and when you require. So, but what essentially happened is that this manual was met with a huge amount of right-wing backlash and was eventually had to be taken down. In fact, the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, the NCPCR, which is led by Priyank Kanungo, filed a complaint to the NCERT saying that this actually endangers students in a school setting. Now, the problem of this is, the manual was a teacher training manual. It was not a manual for students to read at all. And Priyank Kanungo's statements makes it look like he assumes that teachers do not know how to engage with students, which is absolutely false. The relationship between a teacher and a student is where these conversations can actually happen. But also, it assumes that transgender students do not need protection. The schools are spaces where bullying and sexual abuse, harassment actually disables many of us from pursuing education. Forget about science. Education, and we've had to go through a lot to eventually make it to whatever kind of education we've been able to make, often as first generation learners, often as students who are visibly gender non-conforming, visibly not fitting into boxes, visibly queer, visibly trans. And it would have been great for me to have some protection from the NCPCR when I was doing my school education. But the NCPCR seems to care about a certain group of students and not others. And I'll quickly sum up, because it's already been quite long. What I essentially am trying to say is that when one looks at the question of science and science practice in India, within the context of how social structures and culture shapes science, it's important for us to approach it to a couple of angles. One is the angle of diversity and inclusion, two terms that I am getting more and more resistant to because they're so corporatized and mean nothing. But one has to look at it through a question of access to who are the people who are doing science and in what positions they are. But one has to also look at what science is and how science is practiced to critique science at its very core as a discipline which is masculinist, Brahminical, patriarchal, and violent. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for very passionately putting across some very, very important concerns and realities. I would, attempt to summarize in brief what you have shared with us. तो Sayantan ने basically हमारे सामने साइंस डिसिप्लिन को इस तौर पे उसकी आलोचना की है कि एक तो साइंस डिसिप्लिन जो है उसके अंदर की जो उसके अंदर का जो एक ट्रस्ट है, उसके अंदर जिस तरीके से एक विचारधारा है कि कैसे यथार्थ को समझा जाए, वहां से ही एक दिक्कत पैदा होती है, वहीं से एक प्रॉब्लम शुरू होती है, क्योंकि साइंस बहुत बार जो है जिस तरीके से अनफोल्ड करता है, उसका एक नजरिया है, वो बहुत हद तक ब्राह्मणिकल दिशा में जाता है। बहुत बार अलग अलग जो सेक्सुअलिटीज हैं उसको इग्नोर करता है, और बहुत बार इन बाइनरीज में कि या तो ये है या तो वो है, उस तरीके से जो एक पूरा अप्रोच है साइंस डिसिप्लिन का, उससे बहुत बार जिस तरीके से फिर रिसर्च होता है, जिस तरीके से साइंस के कॉन्सेप्ट्स बनते हैं और जिस तरीके से फाइनली साइंस पढ़ाया भी जाता है सिलेबस के जरिए क्लासरूम में, वो फिर एक ऐसी दिक्कत बन जाती है जिसको आप हर दिन महसूस करने लगते हैं। अब दूसरे तौर पर साइंस की दिक्कत, साइंस डिसिप्लिन्स की दिक्कत को इस तौर पे समझाया है कि अगर आप साइंटिफिक कम्युनिटी को देखें, साइंटिस्ट का कम्युनिटी जो है, आपको दिखता है कि एक बड़ा हिस्सा जातिवादी है, एक बड़ा हिस्सा मतलब जेंडर्ड है, एक बड़ा हिस्सा जो है अपने समाज की दिक्कतों से दूर है और बहुत बार एक रूढ़िवादी सोच लेकर चल रहा है, जबकि वो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी की बात करते हैं, जबकि वो एक साइंटिफिक नजरिए की बात करते हैं। बहुत बार एक बहुत रूढ़िवादी सोच में आपको साइंटिफिक कम्युनिटी दिखता है, और इसका आपको एक अंदाजा इस तरीके से दिखता है कि बहुत कम महिला साइंटिस्ट पहुंच पाई हैं अलग-अलग पदों तक, जो हायर पोजीशंस हैं, बड़े-बड़े लैब में जो ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट पोस्ट होती हैं, उस पे विमेन साइंटिस्ट बहुत बार नहीं पहुंच पाती हैं। दूसरा ये है कि जिस तरीके से स्टूडेंट्स को भी जो दलित समुदाय, दलित बहुजन समुदाय से हैं, बहुत बार जो माइनॉरिटीज से हैं, गरीब परिवारों से हैं, उनको बहुत बार मतलब साइंस इंस्टीट्यूशंस तक दाखिला मिलना ही मुश्किल हो जाता है। तो इस तौर पे उन्होंने अलग-अलग तरीकों से हमें समझाने की कोशिश की कि कैसे साइंस एज़ ए डिसिप्लिन में एक बहुत बड़ी दिक्कत है और उसको एक पूरी दूसरे नज़रिए से देखने की ज़रूरत है, और साइंस, एक नया साइंस लिखने की ज़रूरत है। तो इस तौर पे मैं कुछ सवाल और वार्तालाप को शुरू करने के लिए फ्लोर को खोलती हूँ। I request, yes, Shiva, if you can send me on personal chat the questions that have come, क्योंकि बहुत सारे messages हैं 6:25 से लेकर अब तक। तब तक आप मुझे भेजें, मैं बस एक सवाल, एक ऑब्जर्वेशन रखना चाहूंगी, and Sayantan, you can address this. You were speaking about the necessity of exposing the very ingrained marginalization that is happening, and you pointed out that science as a discipline is very much anchored in its society. So social structure is determining the trajectory of science and its thrust. And so I was just picking up on that, and I wanted to get your comments on ये जो पूरा कोरोना का काल चल रहा है, this whole pandemic of corona SARS virus 2019. I'm taking this example because again one sees that it's an excellent example to show how there's this certain diseases have a signaling effect, and the whole discipline of epidemiology focus on certain diseases, and money is pumped into the research of certain diseases, without, of course, this question coming into the forefront, that what are the actual disease burdens, what are the actual diseases from which majority of people are dying and suffering. If you do a comparative analysis between corona and a disease like tuberculosis, we see that the numbers of people dying, and these are poor people of our country and other parts of the world, is much higher than those who succumb to a disease like COVID-19. So just in terms of the singular focus that the scientific community has had on a disease like corona, neglecting the other diseases because precisely they are diseases of poor people. So your comments on that, because ultimately I'm just the challenge is not just to change the mindsets of scientists, but this is a larger struggle of society to which then scientists have to respond. So this is a social question of society, that why don't you look at our diseases, what we are actually dying from in like flies, make that a burning issue for then the scientific community to feel responsible enough and respond accordingly. Your comments.
Right. No, I think what you've pointed at is the fact that there are certain diseases which are diseases of the poor, diseases at the margins, right? So you think about HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, many of those diseases. What's interesting is that the Indian government gets most of its foreign funding to address these diseases, right? From the UNAIDS, from the World Bank Fund for tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, AIDS, whatever. So, it gets millions and millions of dollars to exactly by saying that we are going to sort of get rid of these diseases in the country. But at the same time, we don't really know where this money goes. But earlier, it used to go to these grassroots NGOs, which would then take up the cause in smaller regions, understanding how the dynamics of that region and the dynamics of that space itself. But with the FCRA regulations, most of these NGOs are being shut down. So we don't have a lot of information on where this money goes. COVID is interesting because, I mean, if the disease is in the air, then what can you do about it? So no longer the upper caste, upper class spaces of society are insulated from diseases like COVID, right? So then scientists are also coming from these very similar backgrounds, upper class backgrounds. So then it's no wonder that science suddenly shifts to address a disease like COVID-19, because, okay, the rich people and the upper caste people, the Brahmins, are now suddenly affected by a disease that can actually kill you. That is one thing. And, I mean, COVID is interesting. You see vaccine inequity, you see crisis of the migrant workers, you see oxygen issue. But more interestingly, in terms of science, you see this Ministry of Ayush and the Ramdev Baba stuff that's very, very interesting, because coronil, Gomutra, Gobar has all been touted as a scientific way of curing COVID at one or the other point of time. So much so that Thali Bajana was touted as a scientific way of taking care of COVID at one point of time. And this really should make us question how much power does science hold in society, that you actually have to tout something as science. And the moment you tout it as science, it becomes acceptable and people suddenly do it. So what I'm trying to do is we cannot really dissociate this as a consequence of the government misinterpreting science, but the fact that science itself perpetuates this power structure, and hence one has to use the language of science to perpetuate this discrimination, if that makes sense.
I have a question which is posed actually to Swati. Swati, could you also elaborate from your experience about how spaces like KMT, Kalingamitra provide an alternative to what you have identified as the Brahminical educational spaces, and how Kalingamitra KMT is part of building, promoting different teaching learning practices.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm a part of Kalingamitra since 2011. Yeah, and we are doing great actually. So basically, we do organize, the program, the residential program for twice a year, I guess. Yes, and in this program, so we try to talk about the anti-caste movement, and also we try to give the information about the kind of we have a history and how our history have been erased and also we specifically focus specifically our focus only the students. So yeah, that's why we mostly working on the education, and at the same time also we have now started kind of foundation course, so which is very essential, because in the university or school level we don't get it. So the foundation course is for the 6 month, and we have successfully finished one already in a few months ago. So actually we prepare the syllabus and the pedagogy, in the context of like our Ambedkar thoughts and the Buddhism. Also we try to reach out and focus on the Brahminical patriarchy and gender. So yeah, last time like I think 25 to 30 students were participated in this course, and it was a great actually. So yeah, and now also we have our students, our member also, they also started organizing their own kind of program in different villages. So it is, I think this is going great. And yeah, so basically the today talk on today discussion on the focus on kind of pedagogy and kind of we have a curriculum in university or school. So basically the university always kind of excluded marginalized history. So we try to bring back this the marginalized history, Dalit history, and we try to give a foundations to the students. So whenever they go to the university or colleges, they have their own perspective to see the things.
If I can intervene, there is one more question from Sonu here. Maya, are you there? Is it okay if I put forth that question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So Sonu is not able to open her mic, but she has asked two questions to Swati, since we have you here. Swati, one is what are your experiences in Indian higher education system, and how do they compare to the experiences in the Sydney University? One is that question. And the second is what are the difficulties as a Dalit woman, what are the difficulties that one faces in the educational journey, and how do they navigate educational spaces in India? तो ये दो सवाल है स्वाति आपके लिए, सोनू ने पूछे हैं कि आपके एजुकेशनल हायर एजुकेशन और इंडिया और सिडनी में आपको किस तरह का एक कंपैरिजन या क्या डिफरेंस आपको दिखा है, या किस तरह का एक्सपीरियंस रहा है, और एज अ स्टूडेंट फ्रॉम कोई भी स्टूडेंट फ्रॉम अ मार्जिनलाइज्ड कम्युनिटी कैसे एक इंडियन हायर एजुकेशन स्पेस को नेविगेट करता है. तो इफ यू कुड प्रोवाइड सम इनसाइट्स ऑन दैट.
Yeah, yes, I did my my schooling in my kind of homes, like the Odisha, and then I finished. I did my master in the UP, BBAU, Lucknow, and then and then I started my MPhil in TIS Mumbai. So basically, everything is kind of struggle for me to come here. And like in the school also we have kind of faced kind of untouchability in specifically in the midday meal also, and the way the teacher used to treat us like comparative to other student. So yeah, so that is there also. And so being from like a women and coming from the certain the Dalit family, so we have not kind of economical base. So yeah, so we I have faced many economical challenges, so on the way to higher education. And then I went to Nagloka Nagarjun Training Institute, and then I was there for 1 year, and actually so, and I knew everything kind of our history, our like the movement and everything, started from the Nagpur actually. So and then I was also and then I started to I joined the Kalingamitra Trust, and so it was kind of, very challenging because somehow, because always like, yeah, I have, faced kind of economical. So friends from Kalingamitra and yeah, and like there are many friends around Nagpur. They have like they supported to, even to, when I came here, they supported. And according to the Indian higher education, yeah, so it's always, like uh, whenever the like the classroom experience, we like, always like there is always kind of, the dominant the upper caste perspective and the syllabus and the curriculum. And it's always, they neglected the, our history. So we can't even I never knew like the Baba Sahib Ambedkar, even the Jyotiba Phule and like, yeah, Savitribai Phule, they hardly, the taught. So this is kind of, we have kind of history and kind of curriculum we have in the university level also. So without a, I don't know. So if I didn't, know about like the Nagluka or the KMT, I don't know what kind of perspective I have. So yeah, so when I came here, sorry, yeah, the in BB also I have like, yeah, faced kind of past in marking also. One teacher always, he used to give me kind of the very less comparative to other the teacher, like always the I mean the yeah, the sixth grade or 60% always in one subject. And I try to talk with others kind of teacher, and I ask why is that so, because my paper always, other like the other subject, it was always good, but in the particular in the certain subject, it was always kind of low percentage. And sometimes they commented on how we are wearing our style, they will comment kind of, the style of clothes we wear. So, and the teas also, sometimes it's kind of, the being a marginalized student, we, yeah, we don't have a kind of very, solid kind of, base foundation, or the English, even the language. So we have to face like, yeah, in this also, like in the language, like, okay, some people suddenly they, assume, okay, uh, you are coming from this background, so maybe this is, going to be difficult for you. So yeah, so kind of situation. And the in front of you also, in front of me also, like the teacher, they started, talking about the, like, other one staff. So one staff is like, he was working on, I think, on the around the library, and in the faculty, they were like the gossiping about them, like, oh, these people were not supposed to be here, and how they, they are, because of the reservation they are here. So even the reservation, due to the reservation, we like, I have also faced, and my other many students also, they are facing, kind of comment and the teasing. So yeah, this actually this is kind of, experience I have been through. And so when I applied for the higher educations, so I applied for the NOS National Overseas Scholarship. And whenever I try to, uh, reach out to the ministry, we have, I have been through, kind of exploitations in the ministry, because I don't know, they know about the student coming from the very marginalized community, SC/ST, OBC. So they never receive our call, and they never, email back to us. And whenever I try to, enter the ministry, inside the ministry, some one lady was there, said she always, how you can enter, and how so who is the persons, how you came here, you shouldn't be here, without my permission you can't enter. So kind of, they don't even, they didn't want to talk to me. And it's not only about my experience. So because nowadays I'm talking with other students, because sometimes they call me and ask me some the other process, how to, do that, do this. So they also share their experience, they are going through, the scholarship process, kind of harassment actually. So yeah. And yeah, now in the University of Sydney, I don't know, the Australian universities are very kind of commercialized, And yeah, I don't like when I came here, like I found like, okay, everything is kind of private and privatization. Just this university name kind of, it's a public university, but in reality it's not a public university. Yeah, according to my experience, because I'm doing PhD here, so I am not interacting with the many other kind of aspect, like we have I have friends, so yeah, that is good. But I have also heard about other colleague, like someone, like he was talking about kind of, he faced kind of kind of abuse, and I don't know, he said in that way for me. But yeah, it is not kind of I think this commercialization and privatization is happening everywhere. And yeah, so about the kind of my supervisor, actually they are very nice and they're supportive. And yeah, actually, where they were worrying about me whether I'll have a friend or not, because the Sydney is kind of culture, people don't have a friend situation. So I think in and the supervisions, I think, yeah, they are very good and they are supporting. And sometimes they, yeah, one of my supervisor is very friendly, one is very professional. So yeah, that is okay. But this I think the universities in Australia is very commercial, kind of private. So yeah, so we are like we are like spending much, but we are not getting much here, like, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, that's why sometimes whenever someone call me, just I refer, okay, go to other university, other country, that would be better. Because I feel your everything is kind of, they are just uh, earning money from the international student. And yeah, maybe some other university are maybe they are better, but the University of Sydney, I found like, okay, not okay, that's okay. Yeah. And yeah, we have a racism here. Yes, it's very much here. Like the caste, even the caste also, like, even, yeah, like some of some of the people, they posted regarding accommodation, if anyone need accommodation, because yeah, the Facebook, there is a platform, yeah, in the Facebook, and like the name is Marketplace. So some Indian, they post like, okay, if anyone need accommodation, and they have said, sometimes they have set like certain requirement, like, you don't need to eat any meat, you need to be like this way, that way. So I don't understand their yeah. So you can see the caste, wherever they go, they bring their cultural attitude everywhere. So even, yeah, because uh, uh, other student also, they, I have a friend, and he was talking about also, the student also sometimes, if they face also caste here, if there are certain group here, kind of combination.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll just yeah. Thank you so much. Sorry,
Can you hear
Maya.
me, Swati? Yeah, I was just going to club two questions and read them out, and we could take it from there then. I can see these questions that you've sent me. I'm clubbing the questions from two questions from Kishore, and there's a question from Suvalal Jangu. The first question, is I think this is addressed to all of us, Swati, to all the panelists. The lack of representation of reserve categories, students in the decision-making bodies in higher education institutions in India. This is being identified as a problem, and I think it's following from what you have shared about the experiences of students from marginalized groups who are seeking scholarships, who are seeking paperwork, and it's being postponed. They're not included in representative bodies. So that's one question. And then the second is from Kishore. Kishore asked if he's pitched it at, there is a lot of self-interest that goes into the approach to education. Everybody is just looking out for themselves. How do we change that? And he also, poses this concern that, we can't just talk in terms of, the survivors in terms of experiences of marginalization. We can't just think in terms of the survivors and the personal experiences of survivors, because I mean, the list of those who didn't survive is so long and disturbing. So how do we, make sense of the experiences that are being shared? I would just quickly respond to the one on higher education and reservation. And I would just say,
Maya, briefly, if I could also like put forth Indro's question, and then maybe we could take
there's
them
another
together.
one?
Yeah,
Okay.
we have one more. Basically, they have sent 3-4 questions. I'll club them to make 2 questions, and maybe we can then take the questions all together. Indro basically asks, this inherent जो patriarchal और एक casteist terrain एक हमारे education system में exist करता है, उसका रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी किसकी है, उसका रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी कौन लेगा, और उसके लिए कैसे बदलाव की तरफ हम कैसे बढ़ सकते हैं. तो एक तो इंद्रो ये पूछ रहे हैं, और वी हैव, yeah, that is broadly the question from Indro. If we can take all these questions together now, that will be good. Thanks a lot.
Would Sayantan, you like to say anything with respect to these? And then Swati.
Okay, I'll try to put together some thoughts. So in terms of, how do we move towards change is always a very complex question, because it's not very easy to answer. I've been trying for quite some time and it hasn't worked out very well. But, when we think about something like reservations, right? I mean, the reservation policy is pretty much set on paper and it's supposed to have X% of reservation, Y% of reservation, and Z% of reservation, which is rarely implemented. So one has to think about what are the mechanisms that these places use to eliminate these systems of reservations, right? So places like IITs, the way they would do it, many places like the universities or University of Hyderabad, JNU, the way they do it is by saying that we didn't find suitable candidates. So there are departments after departments in these universities which haven't taken a single SC/ST PhD student, OBC PhD student over years, by simply saying that we didn't find. So after the Rohit incident happened in the University of Hyderabad, the Rohit Act was proposed, and I think the act is still in development. But the Rohit Act might actually be one of the most important mechanisms for us to deal with casteism that happens in educational institutions specifically. It allows, as far as I understand, from some conversations with people who are involved in drafting of the Rohit Act and sort of talking about it, what we essentially realized is that that act might actually hold the power to both carry on affirmative action while also incorporating punitive action against people who do not follow, let's say, something like reservation or follow discrimination in the classroom. Because you're talking about pedagogy, the bigger question, so we can get, let's say, Dalit people inside universities, but what's the point? Like recently in IIT Kharagpur, this incident happened where there's a foundation course for people who come from reserved categories per se, right? Which would include Dalit Bahujan Adivasi people with disabilities, and so on and so forth. And we witnessed this video of somebody called Seema Singh, a faculty in IIT Kharagpur humanities department, who's using the choicest casteist slurs against the whole class, which consists of Dalit Bahujan Adivasi students. So the point is, you can get them into the university with much effort, and then there are institutional spaces which will eliminate them in some or the other way. So the question then also becomes, there used to be this one faculty I'll not take the name, but one very powerful woman faculty, Savarna woman faculty in the Department of Sociology, who's now retired, who on multiple occasions has asked students who come from quote unquote reserved categories to stand up, and then said, I am so and so, I'm a great sociologist, and why are you in my class? Because you'll just not be able to make sense of what I'm saying. You don't have that intelligence. So I think the step really is to bring these narratives out and put it out in the open and really say that very framework of education in this country is caste-based. So it is literally rewriting how we educate and rewriting how do we do science, rewriting how we imagine institutional spaces. And I don't know what's the way to do it, I must confess.
Any comments, Swati?
The changes, it's again very big questions. See, like, somehow there are many organizations, many movements, Dalit movements, like feminist, now Dalit feminism. So, somehow, some aspect, the people are working on these particular issues, but what about the other who practice the inequality? Do they, they want to change or they don't want to change? Because they are benefited from the system, they are benefited from everything, whatever they are doing. So it's kind of, we are kind of contradiction position. We want to change and they don't want to change because they are kind of, they are always benefited from this kind of exploitations or caste or gender. So it's kind of very, I don't know how to answer these questions. Is we need to, come together, all the people to one, in kind of, otherwise we need to be united for the larger cause. Without united, I don't know, it's very kind of difficult. You can't raise your voice alone because sometimes whenever we try to speak something, sometimes police come to our home to investigate, like we have any crime record or anything. So it's kind of, so it's, I don't know, everybody needs to think about it, how we can, because it's kind of, we are like living in kind of uh, binary, kind of two different nations, and some upper caste, they don't want to change who, and so that is, I don't know how to answer this question. It's very difficult. Yeah.
Thank you, Swati. I would move towards, pulling some threads together and concluding the session. Given that, I was requested, the time frame was till 8. I would respond to the three concerns and questions by saying, yes, we're talking about solutions. We're talking about a way ahead. And, I would say that while it looks very difficult, and both Swati and Sayantan have, expressed it seems like a deadlock situation that we find in the higher education sector. But I would say that, when it comes to reservation policy, when it comes to other necessary policies, we have to remember that the whole idea of reservation and the whole idea of fighting for the proper implementation of it is, of course, linked to a fundamental demand, a fundamental demand for more inclusion, and that itself is based on changing things from a stage which actually begins prior to the university. So that whole demand for, as I shared in the beginning, the common school, the complete breaking with, the dual education system, where there's one school where everyone from, a janitor's, a chowkidar's child, to the district magistrate, to the CM, to the PM's child would study in the same school. That is an important, demand, which then, enables and strengthens movements for inclusion within the higher education sector as well, within the university spaces as well, including a more meaningful model of reservation and proper implementation of reservation. It also means that when we fight and win and prepare, when we fight and prepare for the battle for common schools, the same equal education, we're also fighting for this, for more resources. We're putting pressure on the state to provide more resources, and that is fundamentally linked to also an increase, the struggle for an increase in the number of universities, the number of colleges, because this is a number game. This is about physically getting in the excluded into these spaces of education, quality education, because when you have larger numbers, the more you can fight, the more you arm marginalized voices to fight back against institutional systemic discrimination and inequality. So in that sense, of course, we're fighting for inclusion into otherwise right now a very bad system of higher education, but at least we get the numbers up. Then we can figure out the whole format of other forms of education, pedagogy, methodology, and other very necessary investments in restructuring the relationships in the classroom. So these are all interlinked struggles, and the solution, I say, lies in that crucial question of the physical presence, the number, because a lot is anchored on that. And a lot of struggles are anchored on that concrete, material number, the figure. So I would conclude today's, today's Yuva Samvad hosted by NAPM. I thank both Swati and Sayantan for some very insightful comments, and for also opening up and sharing a lot about what they have felt personally, discrimination within their own circles, peer circles, academic circle. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for bringing a lot of concerns to the table. Solutions, we are debating them, and we need to build movements for them. That's the only concrete way forward. And on that note, thanking the organizers, Meera, Shiva, other friends, I would like to conclude for today. And stay safe, stay well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maya. I would just like to take a moment to thank the speakers once again, Swati and Sayantan, for their insightful comments, very provoking remarks, some questions to ponder on, and some experiences that we really need to take back and reflect on. So once again, thanks a lot. We unfortunately could not listen to Yuvan today. His insights on how the current pedagogy is extremely, dislocated from the ecology, from the ecological perspectives would have been great. But I hope we are able to listen to him in future. And my sincere thanks to Maya also for very, very insightful, very interesting session, and for holding this session very very neatly, very there's some disturbance there, but yeah, so as I was saying, my sincere thanks to Maya also for holding this session, and providing your own insights to this, very, very important insights to this. There is one more session that is going to be held within the series of higher education, which will be on the next Saturday. We hope जो लोग यहाँ पे हमारे साथ आज जुड़े हुए हैं, आप अगले सेशन जो भी हायर एजुकेशन के ऊपर ही होगा उसमें हमारे साथ जुड़े, और हम एक और इस डिस्कशन को आगे बढ़ा सकें। आप सभी का एक बार फिर से बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। जिंदाबाद, जय भीम, लाल सलाम।